In 1978, a man named Gene Mulvihill opened an amusement park in Vernon, New Jersey. It would send thousands of people to the emergency room, confirm at least 6 deaths, and collect more nicknames from local hospital staff than any other leisure destination in American history. Action Park's official slogan was, "Where you're the center of the action." This was not an exaggeration. Mulvihill was a New Jersey securities trader who owned Vernon Valley, a ski resort in the state's northwest corner. Ski resorts make no money in the summer. Mulvihill's solution was to open an amusement park. Reasonable starting point. But Gene Mulvihill was not a reasonable person. He was a man who allegedly sketched out complex engineering designs for water rides on cocktail napkins. A man who marked his park's very first opening day with a Dolly Parton lookalike contest and a tobacco juice spitting competition. A man who regarded the concept of safe amusement the way a golden retriever regards a screen door. Technically aware of the obstacle, fundamentally unimpressed by it. His design philosophy, articulated later by his son Andy, was simple. Gene didn't want rides that moved for you. He wanted rides where you controlled your own fate, fast or slow, cautious or reckless. He wanted to replicate the thrill of skiing where the mountain doesn't strap you in and sell that feeling to summer crowds. The problem, as 2 decades of incident reports would enthusiastically document, is that skiing works because participants wear equipment, understand the risks, and have generally chosen to be on a mountain. Action Park's guests were frequently teenagers from New Jersey who had been drinking since the parking lot and were only wearing a swimsuit. The mountain had not chosen them. The Alpine Slide was the park's original attraction and, in a genuinely impressive achievement for an opening act, also its most dangerous. It ran 2,700 feet down a ski trail, more than half a mile on small fiberglass sleds. Each sled had one control, a stick you pulled back to brake and pushed forward to accelerate. This theoretically gave riders full command of their speed. In actual practice, the sleds had 2 modes: extremely slow, and what a former employee famously described as death awaits. The chutes were made of concrete, fiberglass, and reportedly asbestos. Guests rode them in swimsuits. The hay bales stacked at the curves were there to absorb the impact of riders flying off the track, which frequently happened enough that hay bale placement became an operational science. In 1984 and 1985 alone, the slide produced 14 bone fractures and 26 documented head injuries. In 1980, a 19-year-old named George Larson Jr. was thrown from his sled, struck his head on a rock, and died after several days in a coma. He was the first of at least 6 people to die at Action Park. The wave pool was Waterworld's crown jewel. Hospital staff nearby called it the grave pool. It generated massive artificial waves. On the busiest days, lifeguards pulled 30 people from the water. The park eventually bought Vernon Township extra ambulances to handle the volume. This was described publicly as a gesture of community goodwill. The township accepted them without asking too many questions. Then there was the Cannonball Loop. The Cannonball Loop was a water slide with a full 360-degree vertical loop at the bottom. Imagine the physics of a toilet flush, but designed by someone who was specifically angry at you, and it performed exactly as well as that sounds. Riders built speed down the chute, theoretically completed the loop, and exited into a pool below. Riders who weren't going fast enough would stall upside down inside the loop and get stuck there. The park had anticipated this outcome enough to install a small emergency hatch in the side of the loop for extraction purposes. They had not anticipated enough to not build the loop. Testing was conducted on underage park employees who were handed $100 bills. Most came out injured. One test rider reportedly left their teeth stuck in the slide's padding. The slide opened briefly to the public before state regulators, who had displayed extraordinary restraint up to this point, finally intervened and shut it down. The Cannonball Loop became Action Park's defining moment, an idea so thoroughly proven bad by its own testing that it opened anyway. Action Park's safety record was so comprehensively documented that finding conventional liability coverage was practically impossible. Mulvihill's response was to create his own insurance company, a shell company, incorporated in the Cayman Islands, capitalized at a level that would make any real actuary laugh. and designed primarily to generate a certificate that regulators could look at and feel satisfied. The company existed to perform insurance. It did not particularly exist to pay claims. This, layered on top of financial irregularities involving state land leases and a web of connected corporate entities, eventually produced a 110-count grand jury indictment against 9 companies running the park and their executives. Mulvihill pleaded guilty to 5 fraud charges, received a fine, and continued with his life. This was New Jersey in the 1980s, and the consequences of sophisticated financial fraud were, at the time, somewhat negotiable. Action Park employed staff as young as 14 and 15 in roles including lifeguarding, ride operation, and managing crowds of thousands of people simultaneously. Training was minimal. Sobriety was, in the loosest sense of the word, encouraged. Employees and guests frequently occupied the same general state of awareness, which was either a supervision failure or an attempt to create equal footing. The kayak experience was an artificial whitewater channel whose current was strong enough to flip kayaks and hold riders underneath them. The Tarzan swing sent guests on a rope over a pond, fed by mountain runoff so cold that the shock of entry made reaching the edge of the pool a genuine ambition rather than an assumption. Motor World, built on drained swampland across the highway, offered go-karts that flipped on turns and motorized boats captained by guests who had not been asked to demonstrate any capacity for driving before being given one. The emergency room director at the nearest hospital reported treating between 5 and 10 Action Park victims on the park's busiest days. Not per week, per day. The hospital was not surprised by any of this. And yet, over 1 million people came every year throughout the 1980s because the rides were genuinely unlike anything else in existence. Because the Alpine Slide on the days it didn't put you in traction was extraordinary. Because Gene Mulvihill had identified something true, that people want control over their own experience, that chosen risk feels different from assigned risk, and that the narrow corridor between almost fine and not fine at all is precisely where the best stories live. He had simply constructed the infrastructure for that insight with the safety consciousness of a man who had given that matter approximately no thought. The nicknames accumulated alongside the lawsuits: Traction Park, Accident Park, Friction Park, and most permanently, Class Action Park. That last name eventually stopped being ironic. Rides closed under legal pressure, costs compounded, the park shut down in 1996, was purchased, gutted, and reopened as Mountain Creek Water Park. A facility so thoroughly uneventful that it has never, in its entire operating history, needed to remove a guest from a loop through an emergency access panel. Action Park was a disaster and a landmark at the same time, which is perhaps the most New Jersey sentence ever written. The results were ambulances, indictments, settlements, and, by every single account from people who came through intact, some of the best days of their lives, which is, in the end, exactly what Gene Mulvihill told you it would be.